Hey, what is up, mortals? It is SBurgVA here with a new video for you. Welcome to part 5 of What If Deku Had a Regen Quirk. I just wanted to greet you guys by saying sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. And so, we begin. Midoriya stared in shock as his arm slowly turned to dust. The Nomu easily threw him across the USJ, and his body tumbled across the ground before skidding to a halt. Midoriya's arm had been decayed from the elbow down, and pieces of cracked skin fell to the ground. But Midoriya forced himself up. If he couldn't fight the villains head-on, he could at least try to get his teacher away from them. Midoriya amped up his one-for-all usage to 11%, the increase in power making his joints creak, but the braces in his costume helped him adjust. Midoriya flew toward his teacher and reached out an arm to grab him. Muscle fibers reached out from his elbow and intertwined together to reform his arm. He grabbed onto his teacher's clothes and carried him securely to Sue and Mineta in one swift motion. He gently placed his teacher down and ordered his classmates to bring Aizawa to safety, and they complied. Midoriya turned and stood several meters away from the hand villain, with the Nomu standing behind him menacingly. He pushed off of the ground at lightning speeds as he plunged his right fist into the Nomu's face. The creature's flesh rippled from the impact and it slid several meters back. Just as Midoriya's fist made contact with the creature, the doors of the USJ slammed open with a loud thud that caused a pause in all attacks within the facility. All eyes were glued to the figure of the villain's malevolent plans, the one they were planning to kill. All Might. Plastered on the hero's face was no longer his usual smile, but instead a frown that sent shivers down Midoriya's spine. The hero looked at the scene that unfolded before him. Dozens of villains lay unconscious, sprawled across the floor of the USJ. The Nomu refocused its gaze onto the new foe that entered the battlefield.
Nomu, go kill All Might,
the hand villain ordered. At the command, Nomu rushed past Midoriya to strike at its target.
No!
Midoriya yelled gutturally. He turned sharply as he reached to grab onto the Nomu's leg. He grabbed the creature's ankle and he swung back around and slammed it into the ground, causing the floor to crack beneath its body. Midoriya felt his rotator cuff dislocate from the motion, but it didn't matter. All Might jumped into the air high enough to touch the ceiling of the USJ. With his descent, he flew headfirst with his arm extended out to punch right into the Nomu's fallen body. The collision caused a shockwave that pushed Midoriya back. Dust settled and revealed the Nomu and All Might in a wrestling position. As the two struggled to move the other, the sight was like seeing an immovable object attempt to stop an unstoppable force. It was a stalemate as the two grappled with each other. That was until the Nomu suddenly gripped onto All Might's side, digging its claws into his injury. All Might visibly flinched and started to falter under the beast's attack. A path of ice rushed toward the Nomu, and it froze from its feet up to its upper body. Todoroki controlled the ice, stopping it before it reached All Might, which gave him some leverage over the creature, but he was still struggling with the creature's grip on his side. Midoriya couldn't waste the opportunity that Todoroki's ice granted him. The freckled teen exploded forward with a force that shattered the bones in his legs. But before he reached the creature, the portal villain appeared in front of him, enveloping the teen in a dark mist. Just before Midoriya fully entered the portal, the shockwave from Bakugo's explosion caused the villain's mist to dissipate. The blonde smoothly grabbed onto a metal collar that was attached to the villain's neck. "Go, Izuku!" Bakugo yelled, as he pinned the villain to the ground. Midoriya continued his momentum as he punched the Nomu off of All Might. Midoriya landed on the ground with freshly regenerated legs and slid to a halt. The punch had destroyed the frozen parts of the Nomu, completely shattering chunks off of its body. The creature had part of its limbs and abdomen missing, but the hand villain just laughed.
Nomu has strength, speed, shock absorption, and regeneration. It was specifically crafted to kill All Might, and nothing can bring it down.
The creature screeched as its flesh regenerated in front of the group's eyes. The work that the three teens did was not in vain, however, as it gave All Might enough time to compose himself and rush the Nomu. He sent hundreds of consecutive punches into the creature. The Nomu punched back as their fists collided repeatedly, creating immense wind that threw the spectators around them away from their vicinity. The mist villain was blown away from Bakugo's grasp as the students and villains were separated. The creature's shock absorption quirk was overpowering the damage of the punches, though. At least, that's what it appeared to be doing at first. Each punch that All Might threw was at over 100% of his power, and the creature started to slow down. The Nomu had shock absorption, not shock nullification, which meant that it had a limit to how much impact it could take. All Might just had to attack fast and hard enough to overcome it and the regeneration. All Might yelled as he pushed himself over his limit, gathering all of the sparks of One for All within him as he declared, Plus Ultra! Sending his fist straight into the Nomu's stomach, All Might punched the creature upwards with a force that sent it flying straight through the ceiling of the USJ. The shockwave of the Nomu crashing through the roof shook the entire facility. The fight had Midoriya standing dumbstruck. He hadn't seen a fight at such a high level before. Each punch thrown was calculated and multiple times stronger than All Might at 100%. It had him amazed, shocked, and somewhat scared. Midoriya was unsure if he could ever be that strong. He started to doubt if, even with All Might's quirk, that he'd be able to live up to his legacy. He could barely use double digits of One for All without breaking his body. But at least he was able to heal his injuries fast. Perhaps regeneration was a good quirk after all. All Might was surrounded by a smokescreen of steam. He was well over his time limit, but he had to keep buying time until more backup arrived. The Hand Villain and Mist Villain stood opposite of All Might, staring at the hero and talking to each other inaudibly. The villain covered in dismembered hands started scratching at his neck while throwing nonsensical accusations at the hero.
You cheated!
The villain's breathing was ragged until he looked up and met the hero's eyes.
I'll kill you myself!
The villain ran towards All Might with surprising speed, but he dropped to the ground as a barrage of bullets shot him down. He wailed out in pain as a puddle of blood pooled around him. He was surrounded by mist as the fog villain created a barrier around the other protectively. And just as quickly as the villains arrived, they vanished. Before we get back to the video, I'd like to talk to you about one of our other channels, Celestia, our channel dedicated to all things Dungeons & Dragons. Currently, we have a series breaking down the different spells in D&D, and soon we'll be starting some new series as well. So if you're a fan of D&D or have an interest in learning about it, check it out. Additionally, if there is something you've always wanted to see get made into a video, head over there and leave a comment mentioning it. Midoriya couldn't stop thinking about what happened at the USJ when he arrived home hours later. He laid in bed staring up at the ceiling as he kept replaying the events in his head, thinking about how he could have done more or acted faster. Midoriya didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he had a disturbing nightmare. Midoriya dreamt of a dark space. His entire body was fuzzy. It felt like he was being restrained so tightly that his blood flow was reduced. He couldn't speak. There were restraints on his mouth. He could only move his eyes. And he was being watched. Midoriya felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he felt eyes burning into him. A pair of eyes opened in front of him, then another, and another. 8 pairs of eyes stared deep into his own, faces blending into the darkness with no visible features. Each set of eyes glowed a different color. White, crimson, dark purple, light purple, red, blue, gray, and yellow. They remained unblinking. It felt like years passed with the eyes participating in a one-way staring contest. One of the eyes began coming closer. The color it glowed was white. A hand covered in shadows moved towards Midoriya's face. It was like a sleep paralysis demon. He couldn't move, and he couldn't scream. The hand covered his eyes. Midoriya jolted up from his bed and doubled over in agonizing pain in his stomach. Wait, pain? Midoriya fell to the ground with a thud as he devolved into an intense fit of coughing. After he regained his breath, Midoriya glanced down at his hands. Moonlight shined against the blood that coated his hands so thickly it was like his palms had been sliced open. An unfamiliar taste of metal lingered on his taste buds as his stomach churned once again. In fear. Midoriya rushed to the bathroom and cleaned himself up. He had no fever, and he had no physical injuries on his body. The nightmare continued to haunt the back of his mind as he spent the rest of the night struggling to go back to sleep. 2 days later, Midoriya found himself back at UA High. He was scared to enter the room. The class had a day off to recover from the USJ attack, but Midoriya's vacation wasn't very restful. He had checked himself into the hospital, but every test came back normal. He had spent the rest of the day researching and thinking, trying to come up with a logical conclusion as to why his quirk malfunctioned. Nothing he thought of made any sense. He felt like he was going crazy. "Midoriya, are you going to go in?" Midoriya jumped from the sound of Uraraka's voice from behind him. He'd been standing in front of the door to the classroom while spacing out. He made eye contact with Uraraka, but quickly averted his gaze. Yeah, sorry," Midoriya mumbled. Entering the classroom, Midoriya opted to keep his gaze glued to the floor. He felt like he was being eaten alive by paranoia. His stomach kept gurgling unhappily. Midoriya was too scared to eat anything that morning, or the day before. Midoriya shook his head up to clear his thoughts and looked up. He met the gaze of Bakugo. Midoriya tried to say hi to him, but the blonde simply ignored him and brushed him off with a scoff. He thought that things were better after Bakugo helped him out at the USJ, but apparently he thought wrong. Midoriya sighed. Once he took his seat, the door to the classroom opened to reveal Aizawa. He had a cast on his arm, but beside that, he seemed to be generally okay. Although as unamused and deadpan as ever. So, the next words that came out of his mouth had the class shocked. "I'm afraid your trials aren't over yet. The UA Sports Festival is in 2 weeks, so start preparing." Aizawa explained that the school had to show the public that they won't back down no matter what. The students needed to do their best to show the public that the next generation of heroes was strong and resilient. The students nodded in solidarity. What they went through was beyond traumatic, but they chose to go into this field of work. That experience had shown them a glimpse of what their futures would hold. So they all agreed to not hold back, and go beyond, plus ultra. And go beyond Midoriya did, as he trained harder than ever before and over what his body could bear before. He forced himself to amp up the one-for-all percentages he could channel into his body, purposefully overwhelming his muscles. He would constantly strain and break the fibers in his body to grow them back stronger. His body felt odd every time he would use his gifted quirk, but he just assumed it was fatigue. Or at least that's what he tried to convince himself. The training period came to a close, and the day of the sports festival arrived. Midoriya stood nervously in a crowded tunnel with well over 100 students. He kept his senses keen for a signal to begin the race. An air horn ripped through the air, and the force of hundreds of students pushing against each other had Midoriya squished and unable to move. Midoriya felt strength building up in his legs, and he pushed off the ground, flying high into the air as green streaks of lightning adorned his body. He landed smoothly with a roll as he continued his momentum with a sprint. Todoroki breezed past him while sliding on a path of ice, and the icy teen gave Midoriya a side glance. The ice below Todoroki's feet expanded and covered the entirety of the obstacle course's ground. Midoriya slid on the ice uncontrollably as he attempted to strengthen his core and find his balance. He slid forward with slowing velocity as he was unable to grip the ground and maneuver himself. Change of plans. Midoriya kneeled and took off, cracking the ice underneath his feet from the force. He hurled himself through the obstacle course as he slammed his feet into the ground with enough force to shatter the ice beneath every step. He and Todoroki were neck and neck until a laser shot at the freckled teen. A hole was now present in the arm of his gym uniform, and his skin sizzled from the shot. Midoriya looked up and saw the robots from the entrance exam crammed into a 400-meter pathway in front of him. The robots readied their aim. With the fluidity of a pro, Todoroki erupted a wall of ice that stabbed and froze the swarm of zero-pointers that blocked the students' paths. He wasn't so generous to keep them like that, however, as once he slipped past, the ice thawed and the robots broke free. Midoriya jumped onto a frozen robot chunk that fell and jumped off of it to run atop the robots' heads. Each robot he once struggled immensely against a month ago toppled over helplessly as his steps crushed their armor. Midoriya's acrobatics were careful and practiced, as he parkoured and dodged various lasers, bullets, and punches that came his way. At the end of the path was a straight drop down. Various land formations were available for students to jump across the massive gorge below. Each land platform was connected to the other through a singular tightrope. Todoroki was already halfway through the canyon, and Midoriya could hear explosions approaching him rapidly. Midoriya hopped from platform to platform with enough power to clear the gap in between. He felt woozy staring down at the consequences of a misstep, and he did not feel like losing his legs for a second time. He finally cleared the obstacle, but the final challenge that laid ahead was a different type of demon. Several hundred meters of landmines bulged from the ground, exploding in a smokescreen of pink as a general studies student took a wrong step. It appeared that the landmines weren't very powerful. If anything, they'd just slow you down if you stepped on it. But Midoriya was quickly losing his place advantage as more and more students started to catch up. Todoroki and Bakugo were attempting to sabotage each other up ahead, and they were approximately a minute away from the end. Midoriya knew what he needed to do. He wanted to show the world who he was and what he could do. He sacrificed so many things to get to where he was standing now. What's wrong if he sacrificed a bit more? Without even taking a breath to brace himself, Midoriya jumped into the air and slammed himself into the ground. The ground around him shattered, as did the bones in his legs, as a crater spanning the entire horizontal length of the obstacle course formed. Flashes of white peeked through the cracks in the dirt. It was like a symphony of amateur percussion players making music. The mines exploded with the same deafening and deep rumble as bass drums, shaking the earth with such fervor it felt like hell itself was opening up. In the epicenter of this ground zero was the catalyst, Izuku Midoriya. Despite the muscles and bones of his legs crumpling into little Lego pieces, Midoriya forced himself upwards, and for a moment, he flew. It was like he had always dreamed. He flew into the sky and he looked down at the students below him. He imagined them as civilians looking up and pointing at him with enchantment, just as they did with All Might. Albeit, Midoriya was a little more disheveled than he'd imagined, but he didn't want to let the moment sour. His legs were being patched up as quickly as he flew, and the burnt flesh that smoked behind him formed gnarly scars. The ringing in his head slowly cleared up, but he could feel the dried blood clinging to his sideburns and outer ears. Midoriya didn't look very hero-like, despite what he'd like to imagine. He looked battered and beaten, soot-covered and freshly scarred, uniform singed and ruined. And yet he had the biggest smile on his face. His eyes watered, whether it was from emotions or the wind drying his eyes, he couldn't tell. The stadium approached him like a freight train. He was supposed to enter through the tunnel, but it appeared Midoriya had overshot his landing. Flying over the wall of the stadium, Midoriya heard the cheers from the audience below him. He landed safely on his feet as he slid to a halt, confetti falling around him. Present Mike cheered. "Izuku Midoriya has taken first place!" Midoriya ignored the taste of metal that filled his mouth. Thank you all for indulging yourselves in all this information thus far. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. Firstly, if you're in the mood for some great storytelling, We the Celestials has got you covered. Our We the Celestials, My Hero Academia, and Naruto What If channels retell the story of their namesake anime with a twist. Check it out if you're interested. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details can be found in the description below. Lastly, if you're interested in what we do here at We the Celestials, then I'd like to extend you an invitation to join the team. The only caveat being that we only accept members from 16 years and up to join our crew. You can sign up for whichever category fulfills your interest by joining the recruitment Discord using the link in the description below. We're always looking for members to join us. Well, that's it from us for today's video, so thank you all for watching, and have a great day.